Take Back Your Health Now, Episode 12. You're listening to the Take Back Your Health Now podcast, the show that interviews the top doctors, athletes, trainers, and entrepreneurs to help you find the holy grail of health. Now here's your host, Dr. Dan Margolin.
This is Dr. Dan Margolin with another segment of Take Back Your Health Now, where we pull out all the stops in search of health's holy grail. We are really excited to have Dr. Kelly Starrett. He is a coach, physical therapist, author, speaker, and the creator of Mobility WOD, which has revolutionized how athletes think about human movement and athletic performance. Dr. Kelly Starrett, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm well, man. Thanks so much for having us on your vacation, no less.
Listen, when I heard I had an opportunity to speak with you, it didn't matter, man. I would have canceled the vacation. I'm so excited to talk to you.
I'm sure your family felt the same way, talking about nerdy stuff. Hey,
Absolutely.
you know, it's no problem to tell your kids that you really like to do something awesome with them, but you're going to talk about human performance.
Yeah, especially my 8-year-old daughter. She definitely loves that.
My 11-year-old here is just rolling her eyes.
I love it. I love it. So, Kelly, just give us a little more about your bio. I know you've written books. Just give us a little bit more detail about your background.
Well, you know, I'm a good dancer. You didn't mention that. You know, the short is that, you know, I straddled in my professional world two worlds, two kind of simultaneously. I'm a strength conditioning coach and performance coach. And in that capacity, you know, we've had a strength and conditioning center in San Francisco for the better part of 12 years. We've worked with athletes in literally every major sport you can think of, national teams. I mean, if you can think of a crazy sport, we've probably been there and worked at some level. And then I'm also a physical therapist, which means that I get to see around the corner a little bit. You know, people come to us broken and or, you know, injured or with a problem that they can't solve. You know, and this is, again, moms and dads and kids, but with the view from the other side, from the strength and conditioning coach, I can see how we can go from cause to effect. And then as a coach, or as a physical therapist, I can go effect back to cause. And so, you know, for the better part of a decade now, we've spent a lot of time trying to say, hey, look, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit around what we consider to be real preventable disease, that, you know, knee pain doesn't just happen. You know, it's easy to sort of, for us to conceptualize that most musculoskeletal problems, and remember, 50% of the problems a physician will see are musculoskeletal in nature. And what we like to say is, hey, most of those things don't fall into a pathological category. I mean, if you have night sweats, dizziness, fever, vomiting, nausea, undergone for weight loss and weight gain, I mean, this is why you're seeing your doctor, because there's something going on that's sketchy, right?
Right.
Or you get hit by a car, or you sprain your ankle in a sport. Okay, that's catastrophic. So we take off pathology and catastrophe, and we're left with, you know, a really robust biological mechanism, a mechanical system that has a lot of what seems like really complex inputs into it. And unfortunately for us, because the system is so robust, we fall into what we call normal accident theory in our bodies. And that means, and this is borrowed from a really amazing anthropologist, thinker named Charles Perrow from Yale, who talks about complex systems. And the systems that he talks about are traditionally any kind of complex technological system. And he says that because these systems are so complex, like a nuclear power plant, for example, that we oftentimes can't see what's happening until the system expresses a dysfunction as an accident. And so given enough time, the system will express its self-organized criticality, which is a shorthand for, hey, something's not working right. I'm not sleeping. I haven't slept for 2 years, and all of a sudden, hey, you know, my tissues are falling apart, or hey, I've ignored that nagging knee pain, and then I have a problem, or my shoulder aches, or I sit all day long, and then all of a sudden, something happens, and it's really difficult for us to point back and say one-to-one, because we can't necessarily connect the cause and that immediate effect. We have to go back and say, what are the underlying principles? What are the underlying organizing principles of the human being that led us to this very common set of musculoskeletal problems, which aren't pathological and which aren't, catastrophic, which means, hey, I'm either moving poorly and I've moved poorly long enough that I got away with it, but then I can't get away with it, or something's happened in the body and I've become over tensioned and the system is working at such high sort of high tensionality that ultimately it expresses itself with a hole in my kneecap or an irritable disc, right? And what we want to show people is that, hey, all of these things that we think are preventable diseases fall into the category of everyday physical practice. And that means we really firmly believe that they're preventable. But the problem for most of us is we haven't been given this software to this pretty extraordinary set of this machinery. And what we do is we get by until we can't get by. And that's like waiting until the semi-trailer is burning and it's gone down a blind alley. And the first thing we have to do is get the fires out of the semi-trailer. And then we got to back the thing down the alley. And then, and that's really complicated. It's a lot easier. I mean, Mr. Miyagi said it best defense, no be there. So that's easy to say, but harder to do until the last 10 years, because the internet and the collaboration and the unification, the consilience that we're driving from these different physical practices and movement traditions have really given us a clear blueprint for more sustainable human function.
But I mean, what you're saying is really a revolutionary concept, because you look at, as a doctor, we're sort of taught to fix things that are broken. And you're saying, hey, there's some warning signals along the way that we don't really have to wait for it to break down. We can actually jump in when you start to see those early flashing lights and actually solve it before it does break down.
Yeah, and my father's a physician and my grandfather's a physician, and physicians are trained to handle catastrophe and pathology better than anyone else. But around wellness, that's not in our training in our med schools. And one of the problems is that, if you come into the doctor for a musculoskeletal problem, you're asking your physician to get to the heart of a complex movement dysfunction. You don't jump and land well. You don't run well. Right. No one taught you those things. You just sort of worked it out. And you don't sleep. And you eat like a maniac. And you're hypohydrated. And you're a stress case. And check the boxes, right? And then in that 6 to 8 minutes that the physician has to make a diagnosis and a recommendation, you're basically what has happened is we've been misusing our physicians. And we go in and we're lay this problem, and you come in with a knee-related running problem or an ankle-related running problem. Are you expecting your physician to watch you run? No, we have completely moved out the movement aspect, the mechanical efficiency aspect out of this musculoskeletal system. It's like, hey, the knee is just the knee and it's a bad design and it wears out. That's not really clear, and that's not really true. And instead, let's not put that on a physician, because when we have a real problem, surgery is a miracle. And when we have a real problem, medicine is a miracle. But we need to actually totally flip. And I'm pointing the finger at the physical therapist too, because it's literally we're waiting around for young kids to have Osgood Schlatters, just another kid has a knee problem or Sever's disease or any of the other kind of childhood musculoskeletal sequelae. And the issue here is, who is teaching kids, who's teaching young people, who's teaching us? We need to empower those people, and we need to empower parents and teachers to be able to say, hey, that goes against the movement vital sign. And I'll rip this vital sign concept right off of our friend Gray Cook. And that's really his concept of saying, hey, look, you don't have to have, you don't have to be able to deadlift your body weight and run a mile X, but you should at least have these basic ranges of motion, and you should very least be able to express sound biomechanics. Because if you ask people, hey, is it okay to lift something heavy with a rounded back? And people are like, no, lift with your legs, not your back. I'm like, okay, then pick this bag of dog food up for me. And 99% of the time, unless someone's been trained, you're going to see them rainbow over and violate the thing that they just said that was important. And again, we're not pointing fingers. We're just saying, hey, we have done a really poor job of telling people what's important and showing people a path out of that through a common physical practice. That's what we should be getting in physical in physical therapy and PE and et cetera, et cetera. And, what's interesting is because we work in such diverse fields. I had 23 Olympians this year, from a track and field group. We had about 32 Olympians in all. But I also spend a lot of time teaching 8 to 12-year-old volleyball girls how to jump and land and swing and push up and brace. And we should be able to connect the dots. And the thing I think has gotten us in trouble is that we've been evaluating the wrong thing. What we've been asking is, hey, let's use the vital sign of pain. Pain, no pain, no pain, go rock it. Go get it, kid, right? And all of a sudden I get some pain, I don't know how to deal with it because no one's even taught me how to take a crack at it. So I go see my doctor, see my physical therapist, and they're both like, hey, you're out of pain now. But meanwhile, you can't put your arms over your head. You don't know how to breathe and stabilize, right? You don't even know what your butt does for a living. Your quads are stiff and your anterior hip is short. Like, you haven't solved any of the underlying problems. You've just dealt with pain. And the revolution that's happened with us, what we've seen, is that we started focusing on function. So we want to shift the conversation away from, hey, just because it's not painful doesn't mean it's right or wrong. We want to say is that, hey, the choices you're making, one, don't translate up in speed. They don't translate up in load, because it's okay to round your back. We have no problem with you doing modern dancing and yoga. In fact, if you can't round your back, something's wrong with your back, right? But there's a time when you're saying, hey, I'm picking something up. I adopt a more formal movement practice, which is expression of stable, neutral, organized spine. And that's how I address the golf ball, or that's how I swim in the pool. And what we can say is, if I can't tell a sort of contiguous story between low-level function and speed, then I have a problem. And so what we do is say, hey, look, let's take the highest levels of sports and performance, and then let's apply those principles backwards. And we end up with foundational movement principles that actually express the normal function of the human being. And more importantly is that when we put people in better positions, we often, like 99% of the time, resolve their pain because we improve the mechanics of the system. So imagine driving your car with the handbrake on and one of your wheels is sort of out of alignment, right? You're still a Ferrari. You're still going to beat me because I'm only an F-150, but the efficiency of your system isn't right. It's not going right, you know? So if you walk like a duck, and then you show up with a bunion on your toe, I'm like, well, you took about 5 billion steps in that position. And that's not hyperbole. That's literally the numbers of steps. I mean, if you take 10,000 steps a day, that's 70,000 steps a week. And that means if you're walking with your feet turned out like a duck, your ankle isn't working like an ankle. Your calf doesn't get to work 100% like a calf. Your hip is not stable. Your hamstring has to pull off axis. And you can do it because you're a human being and we are awesome. But you can't run like that. You can't jump and cut like that. And so when we suddenly scale up that running, that walking into speed or action, because that's what we're going to do eventually, we can see a breakdown in that the sort of apologetics, that it doesn't matter because it's not painful. But we can add on that when we put you into a better position, this is how we improve function. So look, I'm saying that sitting, for example, it's not great for you. There's a whole bunch of physiologic things, but mainly we see really loss of function of the human being. And so if you only want to breathe at like 60% of your function, it's fine, sit down. If you want to breathe with a little bit better function, we're going to have to talk about your spinal position. And so we can scale this idea of function from low-level processes like respiration up to high-level processes like Olympic running and sprinting, right, to Olympic lifting, to and this all comes down to daily practice, and that these concepts should be able to be seen and spotted by everyone. And the fact that we have moved so far away from what it is to be a human being, and that's really simple. Should we be wearing high heel shoes all the time? Yes or no? Well, did the human being exist to have the heel a centimeter off the ground? Not really. So it's okay. Wear high heel shoes, but understand that that's a compromise. If you don't want to sleep, that's okay. Have a newborn baby, fly to the East Coast. I guarantee your sleep's gonna be wrecked, right? But we know that that's a compromise. And what we're gonna see is now we can get away from sort of shaming people and say, hey, look, here are practices that lead us to better function. And then in the long haul, we don't see the expressions of the breakdown in that self-organized criticality. And once again, this is the domain of everyone. Should not be held secret squirrel program by the doctor or the physical therapist, the chiro. This is something that every mom should know, every teacher should know, every little league teacher should know, and then we just scale it right up. And that's what's happening. People are becoming so sophisticated.
Was that information actually available till like the last, you say, 10 years? I mean, was it actually there, or is it really that much in its infantile kind of stage, or how long has it been around?
Well, it's naive of us to say that we've figured it out finally, because I think for as long as there have been human beings, we've been obsessed with function. And, you as a physician, modern physician, may poo-poo like an Ayurvedic tradition, but that was of people trying to solve a set of problems, right? And, we can then in our modern sensibility say, well, hey, what is good out of that? What's, what we call out of that? Well, let's take the same thinking and say, well, have you ever met Joseph Pilates? Joseph was trying to solve a set of problems, and his thinking is organized around the primary principles of how the human being is wired. And it's the same, he inherited that from dance, he inherited it from yoga. Oh, there's yoga, this 1,000-year tradition of how to breathe and how to stabilize and how to get your hip mechanically efficient and take your body through a full range of motion. And what you'll see is, I think these principles have been there all along, but they've been sort of hidden in the guise of movement traditions. And what we need to do a much better job of is understanding the primary principles underneath all these traditions. If you look at, was it Zamparelli, who was Zamparini, I forget the name from the sprinter from Unbroken, right? That great, he's the guy who, when Angelina Jolie made that movie, and he's a high level. He goes in the Olympics, and then he's caught by the Japanese and tortured, and then anyway, right? It all rings a bell. If you go into the actual biography, Unbroken, and look at his mechanics running, it's Jesse Owens. He is Usain Bolt, and that you're going to see that when the human being functions well, right? Then what we see is amazing output. But the human being, it's important to realize, we haven't evolved much in the last 12,000 years. I mean, physically, maybe our gut biome has changed and our brains are smaller because we eat gluten or something, but the shoulder is still the shoulder and the ankle is still the ankle. And I think people have done a really remarkable job over thousands of years trying to inform us about what best practices look like. And we sort of understand some of those principles, because if you were in gymnastics as a kid, there's a whole bunch of foundation principles in gymnastics that makes you a really good mover, right? If you were in dance or classical ballet training, they may talk about lying and tucking, but really it's saying, hey, here's your pelvis, here's how it's relationship to your lumbar spine, and here's how you're going to move and absorb and when you jump and land. And so once again, I think these things have been there, but now because of the internet, we're able to connect the dots in these disparate communities of function. And then the rest of the, medicine world has come along and said, oh, hey, here's practices. And then we can really start to tie the dots, together. The most important book I think someone could read right now is E.O. Wilson's Consilience. And I sort of reference that. But it's really about the unification of knowledge and understanding that to be a specialist, we have to be generalists now. We have to understand what are the foundations of nutrition. How do I get my baby to go to sleep better, right? Those conversations are the same conversations I have with, my Major League Baseball pitchers. Here's how you should eat to fuel. Here's how you go to sleep after a stressful, World Series game. And that's what we want people to understand, is that these primary principles are becoming suddenly, you don't have to be a deep nerd who grew up in a monastic tradition, gymnast, Olympic lifting in Russia. You have access to this now because of the podcasting world, because of the books that people are writing, and because we've seen the growing sophistication of the people who are actually delivering movement traditions like yoga and Pilates and CrossFit and Olympic lifting. We're seeing that people are becoming a lot more savvy because we're ego-driven.
Go back to the fact that a doctor, if you look at the word itself, it derives from the word teacher. And it's sort of lost that, you know what I mean? It actually lost that. It's become more of a technician. In other words, you go to a doctor at this time, a lot of times you'll get somebody, I'm going to do something for you. Like you have foot pain, I'm going to give you an injection, or you know what I mean, rather than a teaching process. So what I love is that you're really educating people. And if I were to ask you, like, what if you were to say what percentage of knowledge regarding all the joints and all do we actually have? Do we have? I mean, a little bit of a guesstimate, but would you say that we have 100% of the knowledge that we need to function, allow joints to go through a lifetime without getting beaten up? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think we do now could really make a case for how to make really resilient people, and anti-fragile people. Because I think you bring up a really good point, and that point is our bodies are designed to be 110 years old. I'm talking about your knees and your back. Like one of the things that we talk about with anyone who has chronic pain or any back pain, for example, is that when we do MRIs or look at the spines of anyone who is of age, there's a patina of age on there. We see degenerated discs, and we see herniated discs, and we see bone spurs and ugliness and rust, for lack of a better word. Yet most of those people are pain-free, and literally every single person has something in their back, which tells me that our bodies are designed to be able to withstand these degenerative changes. That means I have a lot of slack in the system to buffer incomplete mechanics. I have a lot of buffer in the system to say, hey, I didn't move well for a long time until I got religion, and then I got better. The thing we're going to outlive is our gonads. I mean, that's really the only thing we're going to outlive. But the truth is around the human being is we are not fragile, and it's not if we look at we should be able to here's a good example. The number one reason, as that people end up in nursing homes in the United States is they can't get up off the ground independently. They fall on the ground and they're stuck there. In nursing homes in Japan and in Asia, where people toilet on the ground and sleep on the ground, that means they have to get up and down off the ground. You don't see hip disease, you don't see lumbar disease, and fall risk in the elderly drops to zero. Why? Because we get up and down off the ground. And if you ask your grandparents, when was the last time you got up and off the ground 30 times in a day? They'd be like, Vietnam, when I was, and what we're seeing is that, because we live in this sort of modern air-conditioned world, we sit in our chair, we go to our car, we end up just sort of neglecting the capacities of the body. We don't take the hip through its full range of motion. That, suddenly your ankle hurts, and then it turns out you don't have any ankle range of motion. Well, have you ever not seen a toddler squat down? People are like, oh, it's the Scottish hip. It's the anthropometry. You don't understand. This is my family's hip. I'm like, well, you squatted as a child. So what happened? Well, what happened was that we sort of just became modern products of the environment, just the way our physicians have, just the way people have. We didn't value sort of understanding the whole human being. We didn't teach it. So why, everyone comes from some place. And if it wasn't taught or valued, then why would you know about it necessarily? And so, I think the key here is understanding that we can ask that question, what does it mean to be a human being? And then we can really get to the bottom of what's your physical practice? And I'm not saying exercise. I'm saying, did you breathe hard today? Did you move enough today? Did you sleep? Did you drink any water at all? Or did you just drink Diet Coke and coffee? Are you a stress case? Did you have 5 cups of coffee and then 2 glasses of wine? Well, you're telling me you don't know how to wake up, and you're telling me you don't know how to go to sleep, And what we're seeing is that people are trying their best to solve their own human condition. And something that my wife points out all the time, and it's in our book Deskbound, is that, and this is not causation, of course, just good correlation, but it is interesting that gym memberships in the United States have perfectly tracked the obesity rate in the United States, which tells us, as outsiders, as health professionals, that people are really working hard and trying to do the right thing. They're like, oh, well, I got to get healthy. I go to the gym. Then you go to the gym and, what do you know? Have you been taught how to move or how to train or exercise? No. So you go to the treadmill and you're like, oh, I can push the on button, right? It's like my iPad. And so who teaches us these things? And, I think going forward, what we can say is, hey, look, there's never a time where the human being can't regain function or we can't optimize so the environmental loads on the human. There's never a time where we can't walk more, there's never a time where we can't practice getting up and down off the ground. There's never a time where, if you look at the Spartan race, Joe DeCina is a good friend of ours. The heart and soul, like the Spartan thing, if I said there's one Spartan movement in these Spartan races, everyone would be like, it's the burpee. Well, what's the burpee? It's getting up and down off the ground. That's all it is. And it's interesting that maintaining that integrity, just using the system, is what all we need to do. We don't necessarily have to be brutally strong, although that helps. We don't have to have a huge VO2 max, although that helps. And what we're finding now is that we are being able to put some nails on the board and say, hey, this is a health vital sign, that VO2 max, your ability to uptake oxygen, your ability to breathe hard under high aerobic stress loads, is an important predictor of mortality. That hip strength and power is a really interesting predictor of mortality. That range of motion, your ability to get up and down off the ground, interesting, well-documented predictor of mortality. Well, those are easy. Those are all trainable systems. You just have to make sure that we're doing those things. And as professionals, we just need to tell people, here's what's important. It's not take this turmeric and do this thing. And, there's no shortcuts to this. The revolution in performance nutrition right now, wait for it, is whole foods, right? New York Times just yesterday or day before had an article from Manchester that, Man U has spent a ton of money hiring a chef and a nutritionist to make locally sourced whole foods available to their athletes. And guess what? Their injury rates fall, athletes bond together. These are the foundations of being a human. And I want people to understand there are no hacks. It's only practice and process. Simple.
Kelly, let me ask you this. So what would be how would somebody assess their own strengths, weaknesses, say a middle-aged person? What would be some way of testing to see what their hip strength is? How would they do that?
Well, the problem with the way, and this is important because we want people to be able to begin a conversation. One of the easiest, let me back up. When we begin a conversation about these things, become curious, because it's, this is practice. This is just, I'm never going to have it nailed. And then I'm going to have to travel, or I'm going to get behind and something's going to change, and that's okay. So what we need people to do is have a rough idea of, what is required. So if you had a yoga practice, for example, if you did yoga, in the course of that hour of yoga, you would take yourself through all of the range of motion of the body, and you'd be breathing, and you'd learn how to stabilize and move. And that wouldn't make you strong enough to go ski. That wouldn't make you strong enough to carry your baby a mile, right? But that's an important practice that at least takes the joints through their basic range of motion and starts to begin conversations about basic organization stability. So built into these movement practices are, interesting conversations about, hey, I can't do that. And before we start putting sort of, lines in the sand of here's what every human being should be able to do, right? What we can say is, let's have a conversation about range of motion, for example. I don't care if you can squat 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 500 pounds. This is a simple test for hip range of motion and ankle range of motion. Ready for it? It's very, very sophisticated. Put your feet together, keep your heels on the ground, and squat down like you're at a fire, like you're having dinner in Thailand, like you're taking a poop in the woods. And if you can't do that without falling over, or if you can't do that without your heels coming up off the ground, guess what? You've begun a conversation about your function, and you can become curious about any of the potential limiters to that, right? Can you walk? We do this thing in our house whenever we can. In the winter, it's a little harder, but we still do it. We walk at night. We go for a little walk after dinner, and we walk barefoot. We walk a mile barefoot. And if you ask people to walk a mile barefoot, they would look at you like you have an arm growing out of your face. And the thing is, they were like, are you kidding? My feet, And you're like, that's how weak your feet are. You can't even be barefoot. You have to wear this foot coffin, insulated, protected, your feet aren't even feet anymore. So what we want people to do, we in our work, in our books, in our teachings, in our courses, really have established what we think are the benchmarks of range of motion function. But all of those things ultimately tie into movements, and that's what's important. It's not about musculature, it's about movements. Here's a good example. Can you squat to a chair without any changes without collapsing your arches and without any rounding or changes of your spinal position. That's just lowering your center of gravity, picking something up. That's all we did. Can you hinge over like you're leaning into your trunk and keep your spine straight? Because that's what a trained human being can do, and that's how we develop the most function. And when we start tying this together for people, get away from muscles, get away from tissues, get back to positions and movement, then it becomes very, very simple for us to say, hey, I can't do that today. What happened? Well, I ran 100 miles last week, and today my ankles are and my calves are tight. Okay, I found something I can be curious about.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking actually of a patient, and she is an elderly patient, probably in her 70s, okay? And she was a dancer as a child. And I can, you're talking about hunched over. I see many people come in and they're bent over, they're hunched over, but she has perfect posture. And you can see that she was a dancer, even though she's in her 70s, And it's just, as you're talking about it, I can absolutely see that.
You nailed it. So what's great is posture is a derivative of the Latin word for position. That's what it means. Position of the spine. But we have somehow, who brags about bad positioning? Oh, I've got bad positioning, but you'll hear people have bad posture. It's a throwaway. But this woman had foundational training of how her spine moves, how her head, they use words like carriage, right? But that is the functional language of the spine. And what you'll find, what did I just hear? That, people go to the hospital and they get pneumonia, right? And, and they get pneumonia because they're laying there and not breathing deeply. Because we don't teach people how to breathe up unless you're in Pilates or in yoga or had an aerobic, unless you found out one of these movement traditions, it's not on our radar. And so what we do for patients, we give them that little spirometer. Right. I need you to blow into this device. Why do I need you to blow in this device? So you actually use your lungs through their full range of motion. But, that's something we could teach every person how to do. Here's how your spine is. Can we see this reference position? You shouldn't be afraid of moving back, but we can come back to that shape. And then we can begin to evaluate, is it okay to be sitting down in a C shape all day long? Well, take a breath there. You can't. And now your pelvic floor is compromised. And that's why the adult diaper industry is a $1.2 billion industry in the United States, because the pelvic floor is just a sister of the diaphragm of our breathing. And if we're disorganized, if we're not in good shapes, our body does this thing that I call positional inhibition. Basically, kind of light switches get turned off. So if you squat with your feet out and you walk with your feet out, the hip rotators, things like glute med, don't work very well. And when you walk and move with your feet straight, guess what happens? Your hips turn on. That when you're in an upright, good posture position, it's easier to breathe. When you're hunched over, you start turning light switches off. And that's the root. So when we start to show people, hey, you don't have to fear being in the C shape. It feels great to relax. But understand that may be a compromising function if that's your only shape.
Really amazing. You don't really hear this. I've been to a lot of seminars and lectures on health, and just to look at it from this is such a unique perspective. Just going back for a second, how did you get this? What was it in your youth that made you even find out about this? Was there some moment for you that was wow?
It's funny. I paddled on the U.S. canoe and kayak team, and I was a high-level skier as a kid. And I was lucky enough to discover early on that I was good at spotting patterns. And spotting pattern recognition made me a good athlete and a good learner, because I could see what I needed to do to be able to pick it up. And then I had some really excellent technical instruction. And the way that I was instructed was from a technically excellent, very precise background. When the reigning World Cup ski champion is diagramming the turn and you're 12 years old, you think, well, this is how we learn everything. It's this technical. Then, if you ask my friends, I have been obsessed with the same sets of things. I've just been obsessed with this for as long as I've been around, except that, I tried to put it into good work. I was paddling on the U.S. canoe and kayak team, and guess what? I moved poorly, didn't have these range of motion vital signs to kind of check. I had asthma, so I had a breathing problem where I had to breathe in my neck all the time because my eating wasn't great, and I was probably stressed out, et cetera, chronically inflamed. And guess what? My hand went numb one day. And, and I started looking around and I was like, hey, did you guys, is this normal? And everyone's like, oh yeah, totally normal. Happens all the time. And I was like, you knew my hand was going to go numb? When I looked at all the women on the team, a lot of them had had shoulder surgery. Like all of them, 100% of the women on the U.S. canoe and kayak team had shoulder surgery at the time. And I was like, so if my daughter wants to grow up, I can basically guarantee her a shoulder problem? And they were like, no, well, yes. Well, no one's asked, don't ask that question. And that's ultimately what led me into physical therapy school. But I went to a kick-ass physical therapy school, really, really smart, really good, just clinically just solid, I also started a gym with my wife. And what ended up happening was that, coaching a lot of people in the foundations of movement gave me the insight to be able to see what was going on. And I was like, hey, you tore your ACL back in college, didn't you? And they're like, how'd you know? I'm like, well, because you jump and land terribly and you sprain that ankle, and you could suddenly, the movement practice, right? The way we were moving, teaching deadlifting, squatting, pull-ups, push-ups, the universal language of training was really, we saw it as an easy diagnostic tool. We could literally see in the compensations of how people were going, their problems. And then given enough time, we started to say, well, here's what we should be able to do. And here are the root positions of this. And then we started to be able to anticipate the compensations. So if someone was missing overhead range of motion, I know what they're going to swim because, I know what their swim stroke's going to look like, no matter how technical they are, because they physically can't get into the shape. And that means that we can sort of jump ahead and begin to anticipate inefficiencies, and more importantly, grab them when they're still incomplete mechanics. And that's the issue, is that most of us are just running around with incomplete mechanics. And lo and behold, if we address them, and we're always constantly addressing them, then we can catch them before they become what we call incidents, which is, hey, it's a little sore, or it's swollen, or I don't know what's going on. I can still do my sport. I still went about with my life. I'm not going to see a doctor yet. But the next phase of that is injury, right? That the pain has gotten so severe, or I can't occupy my role in society or work or in family, that I have to get help. And so what we want to do is connect the dots between incomplete mechanics, incident, and injury, and a training environment is the easiest way to do that.
So I've actually heard you talk a little bit about, I guess, when you do have an injury, working some of the muscles that are a close cousin to it. How does that work? There was something you said about that.
Yeah, well, and the issue is, hey, if, let's take one of the languages from one of our early masters, one of our genius masters. Her name is Ida Rolf. Maybe you've heard of Rolfing before, right?
Yes, sure.
But it's a structure, it's a way of addressing the fascial systems, the connective tissue system of the body. It's a model of addressing fascial restriction. Well, she says where the rats get in is not always where they chew. Right? And you can imagine, well, you go back to the handbrake on the car analogy. If I drive my car with the handbrake on, the wheel starts to get hot. I can smell my brakes.
Right.
So do I have a brake problem, or is the handbrake set problem?
Right.
And so what we try to get people to do is to understand, hey, if you become curious about what's happening at the muscles and tissues above the joint or above the area and below the area, then you might resolve the efficiency of the system. So if you're having kneecap pain, right, a little runner's knee kind of thing, a little jumper's knee, and turns out your rectus femoris or quads are very, very stiff and you lack 4-inch of motion in your hip, chances are somehow that's related to your incomplete mechanics of your knee, right? Your body can't buffer your incomplete mechanics and starts to send out pain, which is an important vital sign that things may not be working right or optimally. And just by giving people that cue, hey, if you have tight calves, can that affect your knee and knee pain? Yes. The calves are strangely across the knee and they're right connected to the knee, and if your quads are stiff, it's strange how they're directly connected to the knee. And, I think we just have done such a poor job of giving people the basics that, we have to go and do some remedial learning and teach people how to take a crack at fixing themselves. Otherwise, we're never going to get ahead of the opiate problem in the United States, the chronic pain problems in the United States, the surgeries, right? A lot of these things we can nip in the bud, and we can improve people's function if we gave them a ball and showed them how to address their soft tissue restrictions. Very simple. As a first defense at least, right?
Yeah. No. So Kelly, if I were to ask you, what is the holy grail of health? I mean, it would be along these lines of really keeping your flexibility up, getting your joints to go through their range of motion and preventing injuries in that respect?
Well, I would say that's a component of it, right?
Yeah.
That's the physical carriage. That's the thing that's carrying our nervous system around. The reason we have a nervous system is to sense change in the environment, right? So that we can move and reproduce and defend ourselves. I mean, that's literally why we have nervous systems. And the question is, if I'm not caring for that carriage, for that machine, for my central nervous system, then that's a problem. We organize our whole thinking around sort of central nervous system first, spine first. And the reason is, we see that losses of function and organization around the spine lead us to the greatest decreases in function. But people can relate to this. You sprained your ankle before. It's annoying. Maybe you're on crutches, you kind of gimp around a little bit. You get on with your life, right? You might even be able to do your sports still. What happened when you tweaked your back? Boom, you're on your back. Life is over. You can't breathe. Your body has said, hey, you have tweaked the thing that makes us us, and we're going to shut you down because it's very serious. And that's sort of the idea. But it's interesting because remember, we are a system of systems. So, if you don't eat well, if you're a stress case, if you don't move enough, then we start to see all of those things impact and drag the overall physiology of the system. They're all important. It's all important.
One of the things you said that my wife tells me all the time is about drinking a lot of water. And also I noticed that you mentioned even with salt. How much water should somebody drink throughout the day?
Well, it turns out one of the problems is that, if we're not drinking any water, this is an issue. But we have this really powerful thirst mechanism built in. It's called thirst. Mm-hmm. And if we had people just drink when they're thirsty, that would solve all of the functional problems that we'd have around day to day, right? Okay. I'm not talking about optimal hydration for performance. I'm not talking like how do we manage a marathon I'm not talking about that, right? But what I'm saying is that if you're thirsty, you should be drinking. Now, the key here is to think we need to be drinking, actually absorbing the water we drink. So what we recommend for people to do is, because people are going crazy, they're drinking massive amounts of water, they're peeing all the time, but they're not absorbing the water we're drinking. So if you just take a pinch of sea salt, pinch, that's a very technical term, ready? Pinch, and drop that sea salt.
Okay, let me write this down.
That's right, pinch. And and sometimes it'll be more, sometimes less, don't worry about it. A pinch in a 12-ounce glass of water, you are gonna basically absorb the water you drink. And what you'll find is that you don't get as thirsty because you're not just peeing out that water. Wow. Easy. And guess what will happen? Your joints will be better hydrated, your tissues will slide better. You're not just sort of like grilled cheese as a human being, you're actually this dynamic, moving person.
Yeah. Kelly, man, what a great interview, man. The listeners are going to get so much out of this. How people that want to know more about you, know more about Kelly, Dr. Kelly Starrett, how would they find out about you? How would they get in touch with you, sir?
Well, one of the things that the center part of this is our business is called Mobility WOD, WOD as in workout of the day, mobility workout of the day. And we have an on-ramp program. We do a daily 10 to 15 minute follow along session where we begin to explain your body. We explain how it works. We show you how to mobilize, how to improve your tissues, how to address pain. We have about 2,400 videos on the site, that can range from what shoes should my kid wear to how do I pick something up off the ground more effectively. We have, I think, a really good entree into our model is a book we wrote last year called Deskbound, which is sort of about, saying, hey, what is the habitus of the human being? How do I move? But if you just follow us, mobilitywod.com, you see us at Mobility WOD, Instagram, you can begin to see how we think about the world. But Deskbound is a great entree into this. And then you can get into the textbooks if you want.
Sounds great. Kelly Starrett, thank you so much for joining us, sir. It is greatly appreciated.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
This episode is sponsored by New Jersey Foot and Ankle Center in Oradell, New Jersey. Remember, when you have a foot problem, you've got a foot doctor in the family. Weekend and evening appointments are available. Call us at 201-261-9445. Once again, that's 201-261-9445. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes over at drdanspeaks.com. If you're loving the show, head over to iTunes and leave us a review, and we'll catch you next time. This episode is brought to you by Slate Media Productions. Provided by, for more information, Randy Ramos Jr. Visit Slate Media to see and hear more of his work, visit randyramosjr.com.